The American Civil War, which began in 1861 and lasted until 1865, was a defining conflict in the United States, pitting the Union, the northern states, against the Confederacy, the southern states. The origins of the war were rooted in deep political, economic, and social divisions between the North and South, primarily over the issue of slavery and its expansion into new territories. These divisions led to the secession of 11 southern states from the Union, which ultimately led to war. The conflict's first major engagements, the Battle of Fort Sumter and the First Battle of Bull Run, were crucial in marking the beginning of the Civil War. Before the outbreak of war in 1861, the United States was deeply divided along regional lines. The North, with its rapidly industrializing economy, favored a strong central government and a society based on free labor. In contrast, the South was an agrarian society, heavily reliant on slavery to maintain its economy. The expansion of slavery into new territories and states had been a source of intense political conflict for decades, with various compromises, like the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and the Compromise of 1850, attempting to keep a balance between free and slave states. However, the election of Abraham Lincoln as president in 1860 was the final catalyst for secession. Lincoln was a member of the newly formed Republican Party, which opposed the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. While Lincoln's platform did not initially call for the abolition of slavery in the southern states, his election led many Southern leaders to believe that their way of life was under threat. The first shots of the Civil War were fired at Fort Sumter, a federal military garrison located in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. At the time of South Carolina's secession, Fort Sumter was one of the few remaining Union military installations in the South. Its strategic location and symbolic importance made it a flashpoint for tensions between the Union and the Confederacy. When South Carolina seceded, Confederate forces immediately began seizing federal property within the state, including Fort Sumter. However, Major Robert Anderson, the Union commander at the fort, refused to surrender it. Anderson had originally been stationed at Fort Moultrie, but in December 1860, anticipating conflict, he moved his small garrison to Fort Sumter, which was better fortified and more defensible. By the time of Lincoln's inauguration in March 1861, the fort was surrounded by Confederate forces. In early April 1861, President Lincoln faced a critical decision, whether to reinforce the fort with additional supplies or to abandon it. Lincoln chose to resupply the fort, but his decision was leaked to the Confederacy. Confederate President Jefferson Davis, believing that the fort was a symbol of Union defiance in the heart of the Confederacy, ordered an attack on the fort before the supplies could arrive. On the morning of April 12, 1861, Confederate artillery opened fire on Fort Sumter. The bombardment, which lasted for 34 hours, was relentless, but the Union defenders, under Major Anderson, were ill-prepared to withstand such a siege. Though the fort suffered significant damage, there were no casualties on either side during the bombardment. The Union forces were ultimately forced to surrender the fort on April 13, 1861. The Confederate flag was raised over Fort Sumter, and the Union garrison was allowed to leave. The news of the Confederate attack on a U.S. military installation was a rallying cry for the North, and Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion.